Your Humanities Half Hour is brought to you by the Northern Marianas Humanities Council.
Hafadades Antero, welcome to Your Humanities Half Hour. I'm Catherine Perry. Today we're listening in on another presentation from the 3rd Marianas History Conference held on September 1st and 2nd, 2017 in Saipan. Dr. Anne Hattori teaches in the History and Chamorro Studies program at the University of Guam. Her research interests include Guam in the U.S. Naval era, Chamorro gender histories, and health-related issues such as leprosy, midwifery, and betel nut. Now, while Pacific Islanders in Polynesia and Melanesia have produced many fictional works over the past 40 years, the same can't be said necessarily of Micronesia. Since 2012, however, more than 10 novels have been published that feature the Mariana Islands, the Chamorro people and their indigenous culture, including 4 written by natives and 5 by authors who have at one time resided in the Marianas. These novels make heavy use of island landscapes, legends, and Marianas history, sometimes as mere backdrops in their storylines, but other times as key ingredients in their plots unfolding. Dr. Hattori's presentation firstly provides short summaries of some of these novels in hopes that you might be inspired to seek them out and read them. Read basically what others have written about our islands and culture. And secondly, her paper analyzes some of the ways in which these novels represent Chamorro culture and history, sometimes erroneously. And the title of her presentation is From Erotica to Exotica, Historical Fiction in Mariana Island Novels, 2012 to 2017.
Hafadades Antero. I'd like to thank Scott and Lolly and Honora and all the members of the board. A couple years ago, 4 years ago, it seems like 2, we hosted the conference on Guam, and it's a lot of work, and so I'm just so impressed with the level of organization, efficiency, and the extreme hospitality. It's always wonderful to visit the NMI. I slightly reworded the title of my paper, but I'm looking at historical fiction. And this past year, I had the privilege of taking a 1-year sabbatical leave from UOG, to refresh and rejuvenate and research. But during that time, I was trying to get away from just doing only historical reading, documents and stuff. So I started reading novels, and I used to read novels when I was a little girl growing up, Nancy Drew, whatever. But somehow when I got to grad school, I just started reading historical documents. So I started reading novels, and I mean everything from Moby Dick to Jane Eyre. I was just reading and reading, and then I thought, I came across the fact that there's been a lot of new novels coming out about our islands, and I thought, hey, this is a great time to just read them. And so I just I loaded up my Kindle with all of these, as many novels as I could find. And so essentially today I'm going to share this with you. For much of the 19th and early 20th centuries, the Pacific novel referred to works by writers such as Herman Melville, James Michener, and other Western writers. In more recent decades, we've seen the emergence of indigenous novelists, led by the likes of the late Peleha-Ofa of Tonga, Albert Wendt of Samoa, and Patricia Grace of Aotearoa, New Zealand. Yet, while fictional works written by natives about islands below the equator have proliferated over the past 40 years, the same could not really be said of our region. In the past 5 years, however, there have been more than 10 novels that have been published that feature the Mariana Islands, the Chamorro people, and our indigenous culture. This brief presentation today introduces a few of these novels, actually in the hopes that we all might just be inspired to read what's being written about us. So that was really one of my goals. I'm attempting to share a few ideas, analyzing some of the exotic and erotic ways in which these novels represent Chamorro culture and history, and then attempt to evaluate the historical accuracy of the novels. In my presentation today, I'm only focusing on a few like maybe the worst ones, but there are others, and unfortunately I just didn't have time in 20 minutes to do them all. So starting with the exotic. The Greeks defined exoticos as foreign. I mean, to this day, we all know the exotic as meaning being different, mysterious, or unusual. The Pacific Islands as exotic is a common motif in literature, film, and other forms of popular culture. On perhaps the most basic level, Mariana Islands exoticism is expressed in terms of the tropical environment, right? Ranging from our hot weather to gentle breezes, from sandy beaches to dense jungles. The novel Spirits of the Island, for example, demonstrates this kind of classic Pacific exoticism, describing Guam as a tropical island with, quote, warm sun and endless beaches, gentle breezes, magnificent views, wonderful beauty, sunsets that make photos look surreal. Not only the sunsets, however, evoke surrealism in this novel. This plot revolves around 5 Chamorro teenagers who are said to have been appointed by the Tautomotna as our guardians, individuals gifted with the ability to shapeshift into the animal forms of a dog, a puma, a reef shark, a large bird, and a snake. The teens undergo these transformations when necessary in order to, quote, protect the people from the jungle and the jungle from the people. Their animal shapes acting as a go-between for the living and the dead. I mean, perhaps attempting to capitalize on the success of the popular Twilight book and film series, those vampires and werewolves. In Spirits of the Island, the exotic jungle becomes the mysterious space in which the ultimate exoticisms play out. Native fauna as exotic recurs in the novels, with predictable references to Hilitai and Fanihi, as well as wild boars and slithering snakes. But wild errors also occur in this arena. In Some Boy, for example, the authors erroneously state that the Chamorros survived World War II by eating the monkeys on the island, while The Ghost of Guam describes the survival of Japanese straggler Yokoi for 28 years in the jungles near Talapopo as a result of his diet of squirrels, chipmunks, and rabbits. In different ways and different degrees, virtually all of the recent novels portray the Mariana Islands environment as exotic, as remarkable, different, and unusual. At the extreme, some elevate the environment to a central role in the storyline, as if our flora, fauna, and weather determine the course of our history. In this act of environmental determinism, the Mariana Islands tropical landscape becomes the principal actor, while the islanders become mere pawns of nature, rather than the agents or makers of our own history and culture. Among the novels published within the past 5 years are actually 2 novels that are classified within the genre of erotica, Tropical Medicine and Conquered. So starting with Conquered. Conquered, which was published in 2016 by Patricia Lujan Kineni. Well, Guam's history is an important part of this storyline, with the Second World War providing the context for Kineni's plot of a heroic American soldier who rescues a Chamorro damsel in distress from the violent clutches of Japanese brutes. Chamorros and Americans in this book not only lovingly coexist, but Kineni asserts that Chamorro post-war gratitude to the US, that's a result of liberation, played out in the form of Chamorro parents' eagerness for their daughters to marry military men. The accuracy of this analysis begs to be questioned. Tropical Medicine revolves its story around a high-powered New York art designer's business trip to Saipan. In this work of erotic fiction, the actual storyline, I mean, it's insignificant really, but nonetheless, she does contain descriptions of modern Saipan and some of its tourist attractions. Her main love interest is a man named Gregorio, who's described as, quote, a shaggy-haired, barely clothed, chocolate-skinned fisherman who smelled like salt, sweat, and Budweiser, end quote. wait. His skin is described as, quote, the color of the gooey syrup at the bottom of a Starbucks mocha, end quote. And this can be read in books by both non-Chamorro and Chamorro authors. So this is not just outsiders writing about this. But perhaps it should come as no surprise, since the global tourism industry's portrayal of the Pacific as a place for weddings, honeymoons, and romance is well entrenched, particularly in Polynesia and Micronesia, right? The Pacific Islands thus become ideal places for the fusion of the exotic and the erotic.
Dr. Anne Hattori speaking on From Erotica to Exotica, Historical Fiction in the Mariana Islands Novels, 2012 to 2017.
Did you know that you can donate up to $5,000 to the Humanities Council through the CNMI Education Tax Credit Program? Donations from individuals and corporations qualify and can be used to offset your local wage and salary tax, BGRT, and earnings tax. Call our office at 235-4785 to see how you can support humanities programs in our community and obtain a tax credit for your donation. Sizuus Maasi, Olomai, and thank you.
Welcome back to Your Humanities Half Hour. We're listening in on a presentation by Dr. Anne Hattori, who teaches in the History and Chamorro Studies program at the University of Guam, looking at historical fiction in the Mariana Island novels 2012 to 2017.
So the last part of my paper, I want to really look at this issue of historical fiction. All of the novels that I read could be classified as works of historical fiction, and this is a genre that has become extremely popular over the past few decades. Far more historical fictions are sold and read than history books, right? Yet what qualifies as historical fiction isn't a simple matter. To address this issue, the academic journal Historical Novels Review created a working definition of the historical novel as a novel which is set 50 or more years in the past. Other scholars define it more inclusively. For example, the authors of the World Historical Fiction Guide define it as works that contain any reference to customs, conditions, or identifiable persons or events in the past, even if that past was last week. So by this definition, the second one, all of the novels that I read qualify as historical fiction. Yet I would caution that for the most part, many of them would really more appropriately be labeled as fictional history, due to the author's free invention of historical events and dubious interpretations of Chamorro culture. The issue of historical accuracy has been hotly debated within the field of historical fiction. Some argue that novels are ultimately works of fiction, written primarily to entertain its readers, and do not represent the discipline of history, even if they categorize themselves as historical fictions. According to this definition, the fiction takes priority over the history. But leading scholars of the genre disagree. The Historical Society, for example, asks, how much distortion of history will we allow before a book becomes more fantasy than history? These scholars urge novelists to embrace a duty to history and to avoid misrepresenting the past. Several of the novels I read situate their stories in current times and don't actually spend much time establishing the historical context. The current books include the erotic novel Tropical Medicine, the shape-shifting Spirits of the Island, and Master Blaster, set in the midst of Saipan's previous economic downturn. I'm curious, how many of you have read this? Master Blaster. Okay, hope I don't offend anyone. Master Blaster, by renowned author P.F. Hooge, tells a sordid tale of corruption and exploitation in Saipan. The title refers to a website and an anonymous website author, the Master Blaster, who takes it upon himself to expose Chamorro improprieties and corruption to the world. These offenses include slavery, human trafficking, prostitution, gambling from cockfights to poker to casinos, drugs from pot to ice to crack, corruption, nepotism, racism, etc., etc., etc. His website blasts Chamorros for their assumed characteristics of laziness, greed, and foolishness. In the novel, Chamorros lurk in the shadows as crooked characters waiting for their golden opportunity to swindle the latest batch of new arrivals on the island. Although this book has been praised by the New York Times as stingingly funny, it serves as a rich illustration of Maori author Patricia Grace's admonition that books are dangerous. At a conference in 1985, Grace cautioned that books are dangerous to indigenous readers when they fail to reinforce our values, culture, and identity, when they write things that are untrue, and when they perpetuate negative and insensitive images of indigenous colonized people. In the case of Master Blaster, evidence of all three fill the pages. Chamorro is being painted as generally unethical and lacking cultural pride. Historical inaccuracies thus take many forms, from Kluge's misrepresentations of Chamorro character to some outright mistakes. I mean, numerous of these can be read in the novel Chamorro, set in the 1800s on Guam. This book tells the story of Chamorros living in an underground city who are threatened by a gigantic man-eating species of birds called huenco. So defeating these birds and escaping in order to make their way back up to the sun world is the central storyline of this self-labeled historical fiction. The novel begins with the implication of cultural and historical authenticity by actually opening online on page 1 with an old Chamorro legend, which reads, "The Ladron Island was created when the sun god placed 3 stone pillars in the ocean and covered them with dirt and trees and plants and animals," end quote. The book is loaded with other examples of historical and cultural blundering, such as the creation of an entire chiefly wardrobe in the 1800s based on huenco bird feathers and talons. Yet it also contains some kind of semi-accurate cultural and historical details, a kind of mixing of fact and fiction that confuses unfamiliar readers. In fact, some reviewers on Amazon.com have praised the author for his historical and cultural content. One example is a review posted on just this year, January 2017, by Jake Castro. States, quote, "Great story of my ancestors with tons of educational facts, language, customs, ways of life, legend, etc." I mean, thus there are obviously those who believe in at least some of its content. In other books, Chamorro supernatural beliefs are frequently misrepresented, particularly whenever the Tatomon are involved. In Spirits of the Island, for example, the Tatomona are described as life-threatening forces whose dangers require the intervention of those shape-shifting teenagers who are going to rescue us. The novel, furthermore, describes the duendes as malicious and dangerous beings. In this book, the author takes fictional license by defining duendes as Chamorro children who were slaughtered by the Spanish during the conquest and who continue to grow in numbers, grow in population today by, quote, tricking living children to follow them into the jungle, then shrinking them down and keeping them there, end quote. So part of the shape-shifting animals they're trying to rescue kids who've been shrunk down. Perhaps the most severe historical accuracies, in my opinion, can be read in The Ghost of Guam, the story based on the Japanese straggler Yokoi. There's true-to-life suggestions of Chamorro's suffering and malnutrition, American valor, Japanese brutality, but there are also flagrant errors and distortions. For example, the author combines the wartime suicides on Saipan's Bonsai and Suicide Cliff, and he situates them instead at Guam's Two Lovers Point. Depicting the violence of Japanese soldiers, he writes things like, "When the Japanese caught Chamorros hiding food, they would cut off their heads and put them on display for months," end quote. He wrote also, quote, "I saw babies tossed around on bayonets among the soldiers. Another time, babies thrown against rocks. Another time, babies dumped into boiling water," end quote. The novel's over-exaggeration of wartime violence ultimately undermines and even devalues the very real and actual truth of the wartime suffering. Other World War II novels fare better in terms of representing the day-to-day challenges faced by Chamorros, although there are still some serious problems. In the book Natural Destiny, the author, Sherry Dickson, she opens up the book with a very powerful story about her mother, Bernadita, who in fact is the main character in this book. She's an elderly Chamorro woman who more than 50 years after the war, one day suddenly opened up to her daughter, and the daughter didn't know any of this. She proceeded to tell her wartime experiences. And Sherry Dickson wrote, quote, "I wrote notes in a journal so I would not forget. After I had filled up a couple of journals, my mother said to me, 'Sherry, this needs to be a book,'" end quote. So this novel begins with this very heavy premise, right, honoring her mother's story. Natural destiny tells that Bernadita lost both of her parents by the time she was 4 and moved to Sumay to live with her godmother and her godmother's mother, who she refers to in the book as her Nina and Nanambiha. Dickson writes, and on December 8, while Guam was celebrating the feast of our patron saint, Santa Camilan, the Japanese began bombing. And Sumay's people, including her Nina and Nanambiha, were at the Sumay church when the building was bombed, killing the entire village of Sumay. And Bernadita wasn't there because she had been punished, and so she was essentially orphaned. So this is true. In fact, there's some Sumay people right in this room. They weren't all killed. In the book, the Japanese invade 2 days later, forcibly marched Bernadita and other survivors to a concentration camp in Menengan, where they stayed for the entire war, 2.5 years, rather than the actual couple of weeks. The story describes that at Menengan, all of the infants and toddlers, and all of the elders, and all those with physical disabilities were marched out of the camp and killed. And that all of the females from age 7 on up, the unmarried females from age 7 and up, were taken as comfort women. A horror that Bernadita escaped because she had an extremely short haircut and it enabled her to pass as a boy. Indeed, historical memory can be slippery in the best of circumstances, and even immediately after an event has occurred, right? And much more so with the long passage of time. What a child remembers also and comprehends of an event is something to be considered. Nonetheless, while natural destiny may be the result of understandable errors of memory and judgment coming decades after the war from someone who was a child at the time, the compounding of errors makes it problematic reading. Although admirably capturing the emotional strength and cohesion of the Chamorro wartime community, its glaring factual errors undermine its usefulness as a representation of Guam's history. Although this short presentation examines only a handful of novels, I hope I have highlighted the need for us to be reading what other people are writing about us. I mean, in addition to novels, there are numerous collections of poetry, short stories, memoirs, travelogues. A lot of stuff is being published. In the case of the novels under review, I find that problems with historical accuracy and cultural misrepresentation permeate most of them. Despite taking the seemingly innocent form of novels, these books in fact become dangerous sources of misinformation about us, our histories and culture. Some novelists may rely on the convenient disclaimer that their work is fiction, therefore that somehow excuses them for being accountable for factual errors. Yet novels that fictionalize our history and culture trivialize our history and culture and constitute a form of cultural exploitation. Such works dishonor the richness and complexity of the Chamorro experience, and surely we would all agree that we and our ancestors deserve better than that. And personally, when I was going through school, we read lots of fiction. Like all the Pacific novels I read, they were in history classes. And my world history classes, we read novels. And novels have a way of bringing you to the emotions and the feelings of the time, right? What was happening. And I mean, history books, right? They tend to be very boring and dry. There's no humor. Like, if you read a history book, you have no idea that Chamorros love to laugh, right? They take humor out, they take tragedy out, they take drama out. It's like, and so novels have a way of bringing Chamorros to life, but I'm reluctant to assign novels with a lot of problems because, you know, when I've got freshmen, it's hard to be like, oh, you got monkeys? I never saw the monkeys, man, they ate them all. And no matter how much I say, no, we didn't have monkeys, someone was going to leave that room and say, Dr. Hattori told me we had monkeys. So I can't really go around just assigning anything, you know, well, not to freshmen. Juniors, seniors, that's another story. But,
if you would write a historical fiction, what would it be about?
Oh my goodness, I don't have that kind of talent and creativity. I'm still working on my diseases and my titles. No, I always tell my students, I want you guys to write this. I mean, I understand the challenges of writing. I mean, these novelists, you know, it's so easy to criticize. It's very easy to read something and be critical. Actually producing it is very difficult, so I appreciate that. I'm not, you know, I don't think I'm being unreasonable by saying, you know, don't stretch the truth, you know? Because when you tell these terrible stories and people find that, oh, they didn't chop your head off, they only whipped you? Oh, okay. Oh, that's good. So I'm like, you know, you're devaluing, like, this woman got whipped. And it's like, oh, they didn't chop your head off. Oh, that's good. It's like, okay, problem. So I understand it's challenging, and, you know, novelists have so much to consider. There's so many literature faculty here, so maybe they'll start writing. Any questions?
I have a question, and then we'll have another great question from esteemed Soda. What I want to say is that I think we're all natural storytellers, and so I want to really encourage people to write novels. That was kind of what I was doing in my presentation. And November is National Novel Writing Month, so if anybody wants to join in writing novels, I really appreciate that you said novel writing is hard. In any of the novels that you were reading, do they have the end notes where they explain what is fiction and what is historical and what they did and why they made their novel choices?
Not explicitly. I mean, they all have this disclaimer, this is a work of fiction and may or may not represent the actual characters in the book. But I just don't think that's enough, because people read that as a representative of the Chamorro experience. So they may not be looking for the orphan Bernadita, you know, but they think that, wow, so Sumai, they were all killed, you know, so there's, all of the books have that disclaimer, but, Sherry Dickson's book does have footnotes in the end, but to be honest, I think people who read novels don't really want to read footnotes.
I would really encourage people to write novels and to add the historical material at the end.
I just wondered if you had reviewed Kathy Galt's novel.
This is a short version of a longer paper, and the references to the novel Mansion on the Moon by Kathy Galt, which is the best of the ones I read. I mean, that thing, it's amazing. It's a saga of 3 generations. It's like 350 pages long, and it spans from 1898 to post-war.
Our presentation today has come from the 3rd Mariana's History Conference held on September 1st and 2nd, 2017 in Saipan. And our speaker has been Dr. Anne Hattori, taking us on a historical fiction exploration of Mariana Island novels from 2012 to 2017. We hope you might be spurred to pick up one of the novels that she's talked about today and read what it has to say about the Mariana Islands for yourselves. This has been your Humanities Half Hour. I'm Catherine Perry.
This program was supported by a We the People grant awarded to the Northern Marianas Humanities Council from the National Endowment for the Humanities. Any views, findings, conclusions, or recommendations expressed in this program are those of the participants and do not necessarily represent those of the National Endowment for the Humanities or the Northern Marianas Humanities Council.